I just am coming to you with a brief chat about counter arguments. So, this is kind of a more advanced idea than some of the other things that we've talked about. So, I'm not specifically looking for this in the essay. If you don't actually have one, I'm not going to judge you for that. But I do want you to know that they exist and that it is something that you might add to your essay if you're struggling to um, to make your argument clear, to make the page length, to offer a complex argument. So a counter argument, sorry, a counter argument is when you counter argue against your position. So it's or you find some other explanation for the reasoning why something is happening. So it allows you to anticipate doubts and objections to the argument that you are proposing. It presents you as a person who weighs alternatives before arguing and who isn't afraid to confront difficulties with your position and who's interested in the actual truth or the best option as opposed to just winning the argument. So, not every objection is worth entertaining. So, don't just include one to just be including one. But it does add to your ethos as writer, anticipating possible objections to the argument. So, a counter argument has two parts. First, it is the turn against, and then the turn back. So the turn against is when you acknowledge your the other side of your argument. Um, you first imagine someone who might be skeptical, or you might even use a source. Perhaps you found a source that was arguing against what you were talking about, and this would be your opportunity to actually bring them into the essay. And so, or it could just be a skeptical hypothetical reader who might be resist your point. So a couple of places where you might suggest that a reader might have some problem with your point might be, oh geez, might be on the alternative, the explanation that you offer as to why something is happening, um, disadvantages to your proposal, or practical drawbacks to what you propose. So you might just go ahead and acknowledge that it's not possible to do this, or it might be difficult to do that, or a lot of people would be against this thing. Then you have to remember to turn back. Okay, so that means that after you've acknowledged the opposite side, you go back to your argument, your actual thesis, and you explain why it is still plausible or the best possible outcome. So you do this to signal, you need to signal with this rather, and you'll say something like, but, yet, however, still, nevertheless, even so, those kinds of things to signal to your reader that you're coming back to your argument and not just leaving it with the counter. So you will then say, after you've given a signal phrase like that, you will then say why the counter argument is mistaken, why your um, argument is still the most valid, the most plausible um, way to deal with the problem, and um, you kind of poke holes in the reasoning of the counter argument. You can do that. So, one or two counter arguments throughout your paper are fine, but make sure you're not just going back to counter arguments all the time. So, really, one is the sweet spot, two is a stretch. Any more than that, and you're starting to whittle away your argument. and start to have the reader wondering, well, what exactly is this person arguing? Are they arguing for this thing or against this thing? You don't want to do that. So, the thing you want to do is you can put it anywhere in the essay, after the introductory paragraph and before the conclusion, but typically it goes in the section in the paper that is just before the conclusion. So the penultimate paragraph, the second to last paragraph of an essay, that's where your counter argument can go. And that's where they typically are. Okay, so before you bring it in for a close, you do the turn against, the turn back, and then you come in for the close. Okay, so for example, as I've been talking to you about this throughout this process, again, I was dealing with intimate partner violence with teens, and that was inspired by listening to the podcast Serial. So the counter argument for my thing, which I mentioned, it was that there are different types of interventions that you need to implement in order to protect your teen, and immediate isolation is not one of those. Is not a good idea because the statistics show that after a person breaks off the relationship abruptly without a lot of planning, that is when the abuser can become murderous, not just violent, but murderous. So, in my counter argument, I might say something like, well, I imagine that you are a worried parent, or it is likely that a worried parent would, um, struggle against what I'm trying to say here, which is that there's going to be a process of phasing this abuser out of your child's life, and that these are the steps you need to take in order to keep yourself and your child safe. That you just want to stop the relationship dead in its tracks because our instincts are to protect our children quickly and at all costs. And so that's the counter argument. But me turning back would be perhaps I give a story about a parent who did that and sent the abuser into a rampage, and a violent rampage that ended up costing the child their life anyway, that kind of thing. Or perhaps one of those situations where the abuser ended up taking out the entire family. That has happened as well. So those might be ways that I would say, okay, I understand what you're saying, that you're concerned, that you want to get your child out of this dangerous situation as quickly as possible, but you cannot do that and then not leave your home for a long period of time until this person simmers down, or you need to do a gradual phasing out and gradually relying more on law enforcement to protect you, as opposed to just cut it down, cut it off right away, right? So that's how you would deal with a counter argument. You say, I see what you're saying, or I can see what the other side is saying without saying I can see it. You say, parents may be troubled by this perception, or women who are considering this birth plan might be troubled by my idea, or parents who value instilling independence in their children may be reluctant to backtrack into the days of stranger danger, however. Um, so any of that could work. A specific story, more statistics could actually work. Um, Even if you're using a source to present that counter argument, perhaps you go through and look at that source and see if there are any holes in their logic. So perhaps a statistic that says that this many percent of people would disagree with your argument done by this study by whomever, right? You might then say, but that study was only of 100 people living in this circumstance, in this community, and that is not representative of um, who is largely affected by this thing, that kind of thing. So, 45% of women in a study of busy mothers, 45% of women said that they prefer a cesarean section to a natural childbirth, but that was only of women who had significant trauma during their first natural childbirth, and the subsequent study does not include women who are giving birth for the first time, or who have other concerns. That kind of thing would be a way to argue against the statistic itself. So you have to actually read who they queried in their survey and things like that. So this is the counter argument. It is, um, again, it's an extra, at least for the purposes of this project. So I'm not going to be specifically looking for it, but it does add to your credibility. It does add to our trust in you as someone who has considered all of the possibilities of this position that you are taking. Okay, so if you have questions about that, do email me or give me a call and we can talk more about it, or I can help you troubleshoot what counter arguments might exist to your original thesis. All right, thanks.